Hello, everybody. We are fortunate to be joined by a friend of mine, Alexander Cain, who is a historian, among other things. And we're going to talk a little bit about pre-revolutionary America, the period during the Revolution and post-Revolution, and how it helps us to understand the Constitution that we've been studying. So let me kind of turn it over to Alex and ask you to just do a little brief introduction of yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you, Professor. I'm thrilled to be here. First of all, my name is Alex Cain. I am a graduate of Merrimack College in 1993 with a degree in economics, and I graduated from New England School of Law in 1996. Currently, I am an academic dean at a school down in Boston. And on top of that, I do have a side business known as Untapped History, which is a historical walking tour company located in Newburyport, Massachusetts. I am also the author of 2 books on the prelude to the American Revolution. We Stood Our Ground, the first year of Lexington. And I also have a second book analyzing the Loyalist role leading up to the American Revolution called I See Nothing But the Horrors of a Civil War. And then finally, I do run a historical blog that focuses on 18th and early 19th century New England history, and that is called Historical Nerdery.
Awesome. All great resources. I have both your books in Kindle. I can't say I finished them both, but they're good. They're just full of information.
Thank you.
I've seen you doing your tours before in your colonial garb. I haven't done a tour yet. I hope to one day. And your blog is great. I've read that before too.
Well, thank you. And I should mention, when you mentioned funny clothes, yes, I am also a Revolutionary War reenactor. I belong to a group called Captain John Parker's Company of Militia, which portrays the Lexington Minutemen at the battles of Lexington and Concord.
And I took my family there about probably 5 years ago to watch the reenactment. And
Very good.
It was great. It was exhausting because it was early, but you got us tickets, and it was a lot of fun. My kids still talk about it today.
Well, anytime they want to come, let me know.
Awesome. Okay, so I've never done this before. I've never done an interview, so I'm going to kind of look at my notes periodically. I don't want to be too distracting about that. But as you and I talked about before we started, what I'm trying to get the students to understand a little bit is what pre-revolutionary America was like, what life was like for the people, what kind of governments were in place within the different colonies, and how they related, to the king back in England, and all that kind of stuff. So let me just start with this one. At that point in time, we're talking sort of, what time do you think we should start? Maybe 1760s or so?
Perfect. I'd say about 1763, right at the end of the French and Indian War.
Excellent. So at that point in time, how much, we're dealing with 13 colonies at this point in time, all independent from one another, although to some extent linked together, all British colonies, everyone considers themselves British subjects, I assume, in the colonies?
Yes.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. By all means, I apologize.
No, I was going to say, what were some of the differences between the colonies? What was life like, as much as and I don't know if you're familiar with what it was like in all the particular colonies as opposed to the ones in New England that you're probably more familiar with, but just kind of describe life in the different colonies at that point in time.
Sure. I think that you hit upon the critical point, first of all, and that is, generally speaking, these colonies saw themselves as separate from the other colonies. So they almost saw themselves as small, independent nations loyal to the British Crown. The closest you could get to, I guess you would say, a unified approach or unification would have been New England. New England tended to cooperate one another at the time. And New England, on the eve of the American Revolution, consisted of New Hampshire, Massachusetts with the Maine province, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They tended to be very closely knit. When you started to move further south, you started to see more independence amongst the various colonies. New York saw New England as a direct economic competitor. New Jersey distrusted what they referred to as the New York colony, full of Yorkers and Dutch. When you get down to Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania really took an isolationist approach of all the colonies. They tended to focus internally amongst themselves, and that was driven by the Quaker population of the colonies. When you start getting towards the southern colonies, there was a serious distrust of the northern colonies. Again, they saw them as an economic competitor. But you also saw the early stages of the anti-slave movement coming out of the mid-Atlantic colonies as well as the New England colonies. And as a result, they distrusted the North as well.
All right. Well, let me interject
Yeah,
or interrupt for a minute. When was the anti-slavery? You know, how did this begin? How did that movement begin, and how large was it, or how small was it at that point in time as it began to sort of develop?
and that's an excellent question because we're going to be talking about the thought of slavery or the idea of slavery towards the American colonies ultimately breaking away from the crown. You started to see an anti-slave movement starting to pop up in three areas by the 1760s. Pennsylvania started to have a movement of a slave movement that was led by the Quakers,
Mm-hmm.
where they particularly believed that all human beings were equal under the eyes of God and therefore should be treated equally. Now, whether or not they viewed politically they should be treated the same is a whole different animal. Then you started to have a movement in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire colonies as well. It's interesting because Massachusetts, many people don't realize this, Massachusetts was actually the first colony to legalize slavery. It wasn't Virginia.
To
And it wasn't
legalize.
to legalize
Yeah.
slavery.
How did that come about?
It was, Virginia was first bringing slaves in, but Massachusetts colony was the second one in the 17th century to start bringing in slaves. And of course, they had to start dealing with issues such as what if a slave runs away? What if a slave wants to try and sue for freedom? What if a slave is damaged because at the time there was this perception they were nothing better than chattel or property? So Massachusetts began to pass a series of laws actually codifying slavery, and they were the first of the 13 colonies to actually
Now,
do that.
when was that? What year would that have been about?
That would have been about 1630, 1628, 1630.
Okay.
So they were, it was within the decade following the Plymouth settlement
Yeah.
that they had started to move. And then at the time, Plymouth colony was a whole separate colony in the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
So they sort of followed suit, and then a lot of the other, like dominoes, the other colonies started to pass their own slavery laws as well.
So when did the tide start to turn from that in
You
this
started
area?
in this area, you started to see the tide turn by about the 1750s, 1760s. And it started with the pulpit. It was a religious movement where ministers, particularly in Essex and Middlesex County, started to preach about the sins of slavery. And of course, again, you have to keep in mind they had both a political view and a religious view. So you started to see a smattering of ministers. There's a couple in the Andover area.
Mm-hmm.
Thoreau out of Concord started to question the feasibility of it. Reverend Jonas Clark, I apologize, the Reverend Jonas Clark started to preach about whether or not we should actually be treating enslaved people, as chattel, and whether or not we should actually be seeing them as people who had rights. By about the 1760s and 1770s, you actually start seeing in the legal field a movement where slaves in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Rhode Island are actually encouraged to sue for their freedom. And you have John Adams, the famed president later, and also at the time a lawyer, representing Lexington slaves in suing for their freedom.
Really? I didn't know that. That's awesome.
And the argument sort of fell under twofold. One was abuse by the master, that the master was engaged in abusive behavior that was damaging to their life. And there was also a legal theory that was coming up that slavery should be seen as indentured servitude. And as a result, because the slave has served so many years, should be relinquished from freedom, relinquished to freedom.
Yeah.
It should be said, though, slavery was still slavery. If you struck your master, it's equivalent of a death penalty. If you ran away, there would be newspaper advertisements and rewards to drag you back. And so it continued moving towards about the 1770s. By about 1778, there is now a movement led by John Adams in the Massachusetts legislature and politically in New England. You know, this is a really ugly institution. John Adams was actually pointing also to one, if we're fighting for our own liberty,
Mm-hmm.
why shouldn't we be extending the liberty to enslaved people as well? Which also spurred his wife Abigail Adams to pen the phrase "Remember the ladies."
Wait, say
where
that. Say I couldn't hear that one. What was the
Sure,
phrase?
the "Remember the ladies." So
Okay.
when John Adams was invoking that perhaps we should be breaking away from the British government and taking on these liberties, he was also actively arguing that we should be expanding to enslaved black men,
Yeah.
that their rights should be as well. And of course, it spurred Abigail Adams going, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
what about the ladies? Remember
Yeah.
the ladies?
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Uh,
So you had two colonies in the by about the 1780s, between 1780 and following independence in 1783, that moved to actually outlaw slavery. The first one was Pennsylvania. Again, the Quaker population
and
passed.
Ben Franklin, I imagine, was involved in
Ben
that as
Franklin,
well.
yes, he was involved in that as well. But they did spearhead the movement to dissolve slavery and free the slaves from Pennsylvania. Massachusetts was second, and it was a two-tiered approach. The first was there was a series of court cases, and I apologize, I don't remember the court case off the
That's
top of
okay.
my head. But there was a series of court cases that started in 1780 and ended in 1784, 85 that ultimately said slavery was in violation of the new Massachusetts Constitution, which was published in 1778, 1779. It ultimately led to Massachusetts passing legislative acts banning slavery. And then Rhode Island fell after that.
All right. All right. You brought me to a good point. Let me go off to the side a little bit. At this point in time, as this is starting to develop, and this is all before the Constitutional Convention of 1787,
Yep.
sort of post declaration, when these colonies are now states, they're drafting their own constitutions, and they're
Yes.
really starting to think seriously about these issues as they're creating their own state governments, and some are going to contain their own bills of rights or declarations of rights or whatnot. Um, Obviously, slavery, among other things, are going to be issues that are contemplated. You know, when we're talking about laying out what rights we have as independent, Americans now, and
Yes.
Massachusetts men and whatnot. We want to sort of define what that means, what rights we have, and we'll talk about the source of those rights in a minute. But what was happening in England now at this point in time? Were they a little bit ahead of us in terms of doing away with slavery? Were we in any way following their lead, or was this sort of happening almost, at the same time in different places?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that England and the American colonies were operating on a dual track in regards to slavery, which was a bone of contention for the southern colonies. The thing you should realize is, particularly with the British military, they were fiercely anti-slavery, and actually,
Why was that?
it was twofold. They actually felt that they could use the slaves as a sort of disruption of the American colonies.
And I know they did that during the Revolution. They would incentivize,
That's exactly what they did. They actually incentivized by offering slaves to run away from their masters and either join the Royal Navy or join the Royal Army, or join loyalist units. In exchange for that, they would get their freedom. So if you actually ultimately go up to Canada, in Nova Scotia area or New Brunswick, there are entire towns and enclaves of the region that are nothing but escaped black slaves and black loyalists who fled the country after the war. But what was happening starting around the American Revolution, it was the Royal Navy that was actually the great equalizer that started to promote equality between black and white. And the attitude was, it didn't matter if you were black, white, green, yellow, purple. You're on board this royal ship. If the ship is sinking or if the ship is under attack, we are going to work together to overcome this issue. In order for the ship to properly function, they had to get past any racial prejudice that existed.
Yeah.
So as a result, it was very common at first that you would see on British ships and American New England ships as well, a large percentage of either escaped slaves or freed slaves or freemen. And so this sort of translated into British policy going forward. By the 1790s in England, actually I take that back, by the 1770s to the 1780s, there is this real movement. What do we do with the black man? And what do we do with the enslaved people throughout our colonies? And again, this is, again, talking about moral humanity rights versus political rights.
Yeah.
Politically, enslaved people across the boards is a whole different topic where it took decades and decades and decades, if not centuries, to equalize. But what happened was you had by about between 1770 about 1800, there was a movement within England to basically emancipate all of the slaves throughout the Crown Empire. And they looked at the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy actually started during the American Revolution, would actually interdict American ships, supply ships, merchant ships, warships. And they would actually look for freedmen, or if there were enslaved people on the ships, they'd seize them, and then as soon as they were on the British ship, they would set them free. Now, the trade-off would be, congratulations, you're free. Now you're going to be manning that gun over there, on the British warship. But it was the motivating. So by about 1800, England had, for all intents and purposes, done away with slavery and its slave importations in its colonies. And it started a process of emancipation throughout the colonies that did have slavery. Now, the interesting thing, which I recently learned, was how did England then deal with this issue if they're now freeing slaves? Well, it turns out, and I didn't know this until I was actually at a training out in Chicago last year, where one of my coworkers was telling me that they looked at India, and what they did was they restarted indentured servitude, where they would bring Indians over to their North American or South American colonies, where they would work for 2 or 3 or 4 decades, and then they were supposedly free. But it was forced chattel that they were bringing over under the guise of indentured servitude. So England, by the time of the American Revolution, and England severely criticized the American colonies when they declared their independence. And they said, this is interesting. You're saying, that all men are created equal. What about your southern colonies and what's going on your plantations? Or what about, the mills or the warehouses you have up in Boston? What about those enslaved people there? So it was a very, England did call them on that.
So I imagine some of that was political, in that it was a good way to, to fight in the propaganda war, to try to diminish what the colonists were trying to do by, declaring their independence, and by putting it in their declaration where they're, listing this horrible trail of abuses, some of which might be exaggerated a little bit against the king. So it's sort of a way to strike back. So, and we'll talk more about slavery in a bit, but I think it's fair to say, again, both England and the colonies were inspired and led to some extent by the church, by the spiritual folks. But there was a difference between, there may have been a growing recognition of the evil of slavery as an institution and the hypocrisy, but the reality of what do you do about it? How do you actually, change policy and change the reality of your day-to-day life, may be much more complicated. And I think a lot of the founders had this dichotomy where there was a real recognition about how evil this institution was, but there was also, a cowardice or an inability to understand a path forward. How does Jefferson, who writes the Declaration and writes in other places about the wrongfulness of slavery, still not free his slaves during his lifetime, and
Right.
Washington as well, and so many of them.
Right. If I had to speculate, and that was the constant question throughout, even post-revolution, what is the path to equality, or what is the path towards liberation of enslaved people? I think it came down to a view of stability. How much would a society be destabilized if we did this mass emancipation? Would it be a scenario where it could lead to slave uprisings,
Sure.
for revenge of the slavery? Could it lead to economic collapse? Could it lead to competition with other nations or other colonies? It was a whole thought process through that, and again, it's one that the founders had an amazing idea, and they had a very powerful message, but it was the difficulty that still exists today, you could argue. How do you translate that? How do you actually translate it to the continued promise? And you're right. It's one that they would only push so far because, again, you had this really diverse view of a New Englander versus a South Carolinian, and to just get them on the same page to either unify against the crown or to unify for the common goal of independence.
Yeah.
Enslaved people were the sacrifice.
Yeah, and we'll, when we get to the Constitutional Convention, we'll talk about that. But I just lost my train of thought. Okay, so
Okay.
In any case, let's come back to more sort of practical realities on the ground.
Yes.
During pre-revolutionary America, we have the colonial governments, or what were the colonial governments at that point in time? So if you were in Massachusetts, is it the Mass Bay Colony at that point in time?
Yep.
How was it governed? Who was in charge? What were the institutions? And how did they interact with England?
Excellent question. So you had basically two levels of government. We're going to use Massachusetts as an example because most colonies from about Maryland north tended to follow this model. Starting on the local level, you had town meetings. I think going through New England today, you can still find town meetings in just about every community. The towns would elect selectmen, and the selectmen were usually older individuals, usually about your age, my age, who had established themselves, were married with children, and were at least considered as respectable members in the community. They would get together and handle the town business. They would handle questions of law. They would handle any issues about where to build a road or where to, who to appoint to certain positions. Related to that was the town meeting. If there were major decisions that needed to be made, the town would get together and actually have a democratic process where they would vote and make a decision, and then they would write up the decision, and then they would either send it off.
Let me interject at that point. Who was voting? Were
Oh.
women able to vote in the town meeting? Was
No.
this just landowning men, free men, obviously?
For the most part, you had it was landowning men. There were some towns. I've seen some hints in Lexington and Andover and Newburyport where non-landowning men were permitted to vote, but you had to have a certain value of an estate. Okay, so either your land or your property, your personal belongings, and your financial status were the determining factor whether you could get into that meeting. Women could probably attend the meeting, but they had no vote. Enslaved people probably attended the meeting, maybe on a blue moon, but had no vote. Children had no vote. It was white men.
Okay.
So you would have on the local level, the town meeting and the selectmen worked very, very closely together, just like they do today. When you get to the colonial level, what would be now the state level, it was sort of an independent government. They did not have to answer to the neighboring states of New Hampshire or New York or anything like that. And don't let me forget, I'll also explain intercolonial disputes real quickly.
Yeah.
But you would have three bodies of governing, at least in New England. The first one would be the governor. Today, a governor is elected. Back then, it was a crown appointment. And it was a very profitable notable appointment and a very prestigious appointment. Governor Shirley, who was a very big, prominent governor in the 1740s and 1750s here in Massachusetts, turned any wartime operations into his own personal lining of his pocketbook.
Yeah.
He would usually grant, he was the one who would be responsible for overseeing the militia. He would authorize the creation of towns within a colony. He would actually approve a town if they wanted to have a town meeting. Now, often towns would just have town meetings without the approval of the governor, but in paper, he was supposed to do that. Directly below that, you had two legislative bodies. Now, this is the interesting thing, and this is where you and I can get into our legal background. The first one was the Governor's Council, okay? Now, the Governor's Council of the 18th century translates to the Senate today, okay?
How large of a body was that at that point in time?
Same size as it is today.
Really?
And it was a royal appointment. It was not elected. So usually what would happen is the governor would appoint members to the Governor's Council.
And what, I don't know the precise number. What is it, like about 8 people, 9, 7, 9 people, something like that? 6
to 10. 6 to 10. And it usually was a person from each county.
Okay.
A couple of people from each county. So if you're the governor, okay, are you going to appoint, in the 1760s, are you going to appoint a guy named Adams, or, you're going to appoint a guy named Ruggles? You're going to go with the guy named Ruggles because he was loyal to the crown. Usually the Governor's Council served as an advisory body. It did have limited legislative authority and appointment authority, but usually it served as the government's advisor council. But it was a very powerful committee. Today, what's remnant of the Governor's Council is their appointment authority, where I think it's judges, clerks, and a few other people. Beneath, now today, Senate, House of Representatives, or the legislature. Beneath the Governor's Council in the 18th century would have been the Massachusetts legislature. And you would have seen this similar setup in New York, in New Hampshire, Rhode Island. Pennsylvania was a little funky. They had a governor and then they just had a legislature, and the legislature was Quaker controlled. So the governor and the legislature are always at odds with each other. So
that was just a single house in Pennsylvania. So that's why Franklin tended to favor a single legislative house.
Exactly. It was influenced. And so when they were drafting how to set up on the Constitutional Convention, they were looking at their own states. So on the Massachusetts level, you did have a House of Representatives or a legislature, and that was it was about at least one representative from each town. Some of the larger towns like Haverhill, Andover, Concord, might have been able to squeeze 2 representatives to the legislature, but generally it was 1 representative per town. How was they chosen? Usually by a town meeting or chosen by the selectmen. And they were responsible for colonial laws. So what would happen is you would have your royal crown laws that were coming over from England that governed. So that usually dealt with maritime law, dealt with military scenarios, dealt with taxation. But then you would have your local laws that dealt with militia. How and when do you raise a militia? Dealing with health issues. We're in a health crisis right now. The legislature could pass resolves or acts dealing with, smallpox.
Okay, so that's interesting. I didn't know that the crown basically left all that to the colonies to come up with their own laws to govern those sorts of affairs. The crown only had a certain, jurisdiction, say, or they chose to only decree in a certain area and leave the rest, what we now call, I guess, your state police powers or whatnot. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know how intrusive the crown was at that point in time, aside from the appointment of the royal governor and, by virtue of that, I guess, the Governor's Council.
Yes. I mean, it's in theory, all the law, if you asked an 18th century lawyer from New England, they're going to say all law is trickling down from the crown. But when it comes to day-to-day operation, it was the Massachusetts legislature that was passing laws how to deal with it. They had laws that would pass on, for example, alcohol.
Mhm.
How much alcohol could be, be of a certain percentage, of a certain quality. What to do with rum? How should rum be sold? If the legislature also passed regulations regarding if somebody wanted to open a tavern.
Mhm.
Generally, either you had to petition a legislature, or eventually they decentralized it and gave it to the towns to authorize licensing. Um, so it was very interesting when it came to government contracts. Often, sometimes the legislature, for example, the French and Indian War, Massachusetts sent its own troops to the war. Well, the
Mhm.
Massachusetts legislature set legal resolves and acts how contractors were supposed to act and what they were supposed to actually deal with. So you definitely see that. Where Crown authority, when you have this little decentralization, came in, a perfect example was land.
Mhm.
If you look at New England saw pretty much Vermont and New York, the New York frontier, as well as the Maine frontier and Nova Scotia
Mhm.
as all of their territory. So a perfect example is what is referred to now as the state of Vermont. Back then was the Hampshire Grants.
Mhm.
You had land speculators from New Hampshire who were selling plots of land in Vermont, and you had New York that was
Yeah.
selling plots of land in Vermont.
Yeah.
New Hampshire claimed that their border went all the way to Lake Champlain
Mhm.
and the St. Lawrence River area. New York basically said, no, your border ends at the Connecticut River. So basically, you had both colonies selling land plots, to two different people,
Yeah.
and then it ended up in a border war. So eventually, how do you resolve that? Because these two colonies are, for all purposes, separate countries.
Mhm.
Okay, so you can't take them into a New Hampshire court and sue New York, and you can't go into a royal court in New York and sue them there. So for land disputes, or if you had waterway disputes or anything along those lines, you actually had to petition the king. So that's an example where the crown would actually come in and make a decision. And
Okay.
in the
So
case of the Hampshire Grants, New York won out, which was another motivating factor for the war.
okay, hold on.
Um,
So let's back up for a second. So
yeah,
obviously we have judicial systems in each of the colonies
yes,
set up to, um, to resolve disputes as much as they
hmm
can within the colonies. Certain things, when you have intercolonial disputes, the crown is going to, you know, decide those matters, and that
yes,
actually that makes some sense because, as we'll later see in Article 3 of the Constitution, when they're deciding what the jurisdiction, the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court will be,
hmm
there was probably some hearkening back to what kinds of things the crown had to decide, what was not capable for the states or colonies to decide it themselves. There needs to be a more national entity to make those decisions. So, I mean, I never really thought about how they came up with the particular jurisdiction that they did, but that would make sense. They had some experience back
yes.
in the colonial era.
They were heavily influenced by English legal system, English governmental policies, even the English constitutions. Which were more common law, were all heavily influential in the shaping of the American government. Even as you indicate, the crown's the court system.
Yeah.
Court system was an example of crown control. Usually, judges were appointed by the king. Prosecutors were generally appointed by the governors with the crown authority. Even just trying to, as a defense attorney, trying to get into certain cases, you might need governmental approval. But it was heavily influenced, both the jury system, the setting up of an appellate system, even again going into the rights that individuals had in the legal system were all English influenced, and then the American system sort of expanded upon it.
Yes. Okay. So while we have, what we would recognize, has an appearance of a similar sort of setup to what we see today with, You have your most local level, your town meetings, your selectmen. You have some legislative body that the
Uh-huh.
towns have some say in selecting. You've got your governor's council, who are appointed by the governor, who himself was appointed by the king.
Uh-huh.
You have the judicial system, which is obviously influenced by, English law, and then certain disputes are left to the king to resolve anyway.
Uh-huh.
Ultimately, while you have the appearance of this independent governmental structure, it still sounds like the king ultimately can uh, make whatever he wants to happen happen. I mean, he ultimately has enough control over the players that it would be very difficult for the colonies to really govern themselves independently if they were doing so in a way that was contrary to what the king wanted. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say. I mean, generally speaking, the ultimate authority rested in the crown. That there is political theory from the time that it was a shared authority with Parliament, but ultimately, even Parliament sort of gave some deference to the crown. So the famous line from 1776, when King George learned of the Declaration of Independence, his response was, "The colonies shall not be emancipated," reflects that attitude that,
Yeah.
no, I'm the last authority. You're not going to pull this stunt.
Yeah. So at this point in time, leading up to the revolution, my understanding is at the time of the French and Indian War, the colonists, you know, were significant participants in fighting for their own land, fighting, alongside the crown, but defending their own country.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, the period of benign neglect by the king
Mm-hmm.
had been pretty good for the colonies. The colonies
Yes.
were able to do things on their own. They really weren't interfered with much by the king. At this point in time,
Mm-hmm.
he had a lot of other things on his plate. Things were going okay. He was busy. After the French and Indian War, which was an incredibly expensive, effort by the king, things started to change because the colonies started to feel more, worthy of respect and
Mm-hmm.
independence, control over their own lives, and the king needed to sort of knock them down and make sure they paid what he felt they owed him for everything he had done for his subjects by defending them and whatnot. I mean, is that in my view, that sort of started to be the genesis of the real conflict, the growing independent mind of the colonists and the king taking notice of it and trying to remind them who was in charge. Is that, you know,
You're spot on. You have to keep in mind in 1763, when the French and Indian War ended, England was in massive, massive debt. Now, from the crown perspective, yes, the Americans did participate in the French and Indian War. There's countless men who enlisted in provincial units and went off to the frontier to fight for the crown. If you ask the crown, their response is going to be, well, yeah, they were there, but they were basically digging, entrenchments and doing a support role while we were actually on the frontier fighting. But the ultimate response was, okay, regardless if they fought or not, we fought to make sure the French don't continue coming down off
yeah,
the frontier and burning your homes. We racked up a massive debt as a result of it. Time for you guys to pay up for your benefit. And that's what triggered it. So you had the American colonies, particularly New England, had this sense between 1745 with the fall of Louisburg, all the way up to 1763 that, hey, we can do things pretty nicely on our own. Things are going great between us and England.
mm-hmm.
You let us do our show and you don't bother us. Things are great. And so what happened was in 1763, that was the genesis, as you indicated, where the crown realized, hey, we've got to pay these debts. Now, part of it was when they looked at paying the debts, they said, why are we losing money with our current taxation system?
Mm-hmm.
And they realized, well, first of all, many of the American colonies aren't paying the taxation. Secondly, they're trading with with countries they shouldn't be, France and Spain and the Dutch Netherlands. And third, for the areas where they are supposed to be buying English goods, they are actually engaged in high rates of smuggling.
Oh,
So and
yeah,
this entire area is rife with smuggling.
yeah,
Newburyport, Salem, Boston, Plymouth, they're Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They are hotbeds of smuggling. So when they started saying, well, America, the American colonies are going to start paying back this taxation, start paying back this debt through taxation, they attached on policies to sort of clamp down on this skirting around English laws and policies about you're only supposed to service the crown economically. You're not
yeah.
supposed to deal with France or Dutch Netherlands or anything like that.
And I think it's, if you take a fair view, you understand where both sides are coming from here. It's not,
Yes.
you know, neither side is not without, without some fault, and there's merit to each of their perspectives. It's just, would it have been possible to reconcile? And obviously, many people hoped that would have. Well, we'll get to. Okay, so this is sort of what we're dealing with here. So we've talked a little bit about the pre-revolutionary governments. We've talked about the growing conflict as the colonies resist the king's efforts. There's some sort of off and on, but ultimately he doesn't give up, of course, and the efforts become more, maybe more crass or less nuanced. They're a little more bold, although they're kind of limited. Certain efforts are sort of scrapped and other ones are put in place. But ultimately, the king is not in any way giving an indication that he's going to be giving this up. I mean, it's not going to happen. He's just trying different things and cracking down and probably getting more and more frustrated at what he's hearing is happening, across the Atlantic.
Right. And as a reference point, before I transition into that, if you take a look at the king's stubbornness in the 18th century, and you look at the English government's response to a uprising in Canada in the 19th century, you can see that England learned from their mistake in the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Because that, very briefly, that uprising, which took place in Upper Canada, it lasted about a month, and immediately England sent officials over saying, okay, what can we do to try and resolve this?
Yeah.
They didn't do that in the 18th century, in the 1760s America. Their response was, wait a minute, you're resisting our policies. You're engaging in rioting, and you're engaging in embargoes, and all these politicians are talking about how evil we are. What the heck is going on here?
Now, there was just unimaginable that he just couldn't see. I mean, his subjects, who he assumed just loved him and everything about him, it probably was just shocking, because a monarch is not used to hearing this sort of resistance from his subjects or her subjects.
Right. There was occasional rioting in London, and there's occasional rioting throughout the colonies in different locations, but it was nothing politically driven like this, where they were actually saying, in a nutshell, up until about 1768, it was more rioting against Parliament, and I can talk about that when we talk about the mindset in a minute. It was more rioting against Parliament, but for law and order purposes, the king is going, what is going on here? Why are they engaged in this outrageous behavior?
Yeah.
And it was relatively shocking. Now, there was a smattering of politicians in Parliament who was very supportive of the American colonies. I believe one was Thomas Burke, and he was very good for the colonies. They are standing up for their English liberties and their English rights. Good for them for their asserting what they're doing. But the majority of Parliament and the Crown was, what the heck is going on here? This is absolutely shocking. And the rioting and the protests actually turned public opinion in England in the mid-1760s. Really? Yeah, it was like a wave, but it was up and down. But that was part of the reasons why they pulled, for example, the Stamp Act in the 1765. It wasn't just the embargoes and the rioting. It was also a combination of those two, plus public pressure back home to lift it.
All right, so let me see if I understand. You're saying public opinion basically became more favorably inclined towards what the colonists were saying, or the opposite? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was highs and lows in the English population during the American Revolutionary era. There were times they were very supportive of the American colonies, and the American colonies and looking at social media today, they ran a great
Yeah.
social media
Yeah.
campaign back in the 18th century.
Oh, sure.
A side example is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The American version of what happened reached England 3 weeks to 4 weeks before the Crown version did, and it went
Yeah.
right to it. It went right to Burke in a newspaper. So you can imagine
Yeah.
they had mindset.
Also, the Revere's etching of the
Yep.
Boston Massacre. I mean, it's a perfect example of kind of propaganda.
Yep.
Very effective propaganda.
Yes.
Um,
So it was definitely highs and lows. There were other times when the Declaration of Independence came out, the English population was like, "Oh, hell no,"
yeah.
and they were fiercely anti-American. But as the war went on, it became more and more unpopular
Sure.
in the Crown, and it just basically, by the end, it was a Vietnam era
Yeah.
approach to the war.
So the Crown's efforts to get the colonies under control became, harsher and harsher.
Yep.
We have in 1775, shot heard around the world, Battle of
Uh-huh.
Lexington and Concord, and we don't need to kind of go through all that history, but that was sort of a crystallizing event
Yes.
in the colonies and probably in England as well. So 1776 comes, the Second Continental Congress down
Uh-huh.
in Philadelphia. What was the Second Continental Congress doing there in the first place? I assume they had been was the First Continental Congress disbanded by the king, or what was, how was that happening?
It's interesting because there is a history within the colonies of having congresses. It dates back to probably the beginning of the 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century. And generally, these congresses met for purposes of developing a cooperation and sort of a plan in addressing French threats or addressing certain issues. There was one Congress, I believe it was the Albany Congress, that was in the 1760s, I think. It might have been the 1750s, that was slightly critical of governmental policy from the Crown. But again, it was designed to address, how can the colonies work together?
Yeah.
Usually the practice was with Congresses, they would traditionally disband at the end of their meeting. They would meet for a month or 2 or 3 or 4, and then there would be a motion at the end. Okay, we'll disband and we'll regroup at some future time. So it was not a Crown policy or a Crown order. Hey, you're done. When the First Continental Congress ended, there was, okay, we will regroup at some future date, and then they would all vote to disband.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, the Crown did disband some of the colonial legislative bodies.
Yes.
Before the Revolution.
Yes.
When they got a little uppity.
Exactly. No, it was known as the Intolerable Acts. It was in response to the Boston Tea Party. Disbanded the Massachusetts legislature, revoked their charter, ended up disbanding town meetings, and then it basically turned it into martial law in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. So that was really in their mind when they were going into the Second Continental Congress. So the Second Continental Congress was in operation pretty much from the siege of Boston onward. So they were already having meetings in 1775, late 1775. And initially, it was, okay, we've stepped into this mess, now what do we do?
Yeah.
So they had 3 purposes. One was, up until the Olive Branch petition, it was, can we try and resolve this peacefully? Can we diffuse the situation with the Crown? The second was, okay, we have this conglomerate of an army that is outside of Boston. And it has everything from, preachy Congregationalist New Englanders all the way down to heathen Virginians and everything in between. Yeah. What do we do with how do we organize this army? How do we ensure it's supplied? How do we make sure it's still operational? What's going on here? And then finally, the plan was, what's our long game? How do we deal with the long game here? And they started, developing plans about how the colony should move forward if there's an amicable resolution, and then slowly, if there's not a peaceful resolution, what do we do?
Yeah.
Well, is ultimately, once the Crown responded to the Olive Branch petition with an announcement saying, you will surrender unconditionally, and by the way, I'm sending more troops.
Yeah.
At that point, they realized they've crossed the Rubicon. It's too late, and it's time for independence.
So independence is declared.
Yes.
At that point in time, I mean, you hear the the commonly recited breakdown is that
Yep.
maybe a third of the colonial population was in favor of independence, a third were loyalists, were not in
Mhm.
favor of it, and a third was probably somewhere in the middle. Is that a pretty accurate breakdown, as much as you can
There's,
tell?
as much as you can tell, yes. There's a historian who's done some research as part of his doctoral thesis where he suggests that maybe if you took 2/3 of the population, they could care less and were
Really, that many? Yeah.
disaffected, and then the remaining third could have been divided between loyalist and patriot. But the third. I mean, there's a general setting of the wartime setting. There was a population that was truly pro independence. There was a segment that was truly pro loyalist or law and order from their perspective. And then there were others, and I've seen them around even New England, who were like, nobody's knocking on my farm door. I'm not really
Yeah.
worried about what's going on.
Well, I think that's just human nature. We look at the world today and the events that are going on around us. And I think that probably is a pretty familiar breakdown, or pretty similar
Yes,
to how the current population would break down in their views of it.
exactly.
So independence is declared. These colonies are now no longer colonies. They're states. Are they all drafting their own constitutions at this point in time, or do they need to do that?
They are. They are. They're not sure how to approach it. So keep in mind the common theme, and this was actually a common theme up to the American Civil War, with the colonies, now states, sort of saw themselves as independent of one another. Prior to the American Civil War, the states, or an American would refer to the country as these United States.
Yes.
After the American Civil War, it became the United States.
Yeah.
So you have this mindset going in. You also have this mindset where particularly in New England, but it did spread throughout all the other colonies, to the point people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry are citing this. Prior to the war, there is this belief that the English government is trying to enslave them. They're trying to provoke a war with them through first economic policies, then quartering of troops, and then the Boston Massacre, then the events at Lexington and Concord. There is this conspiratorial theory that is very, very prevalent throughout the American colonies, that the crown is going to treat us just like they treated Ireland or India. They're going to take away our rights as Englishmen and enslave us. So when they went into the constitutional phase in these states, that was very, very big on their mind.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to ensure that whatever government we create will not try and enslave the people? And so as a result, when you start seeing, for example, the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, the Massachusetts Constitution, which served as a model for the United States Constitution, you see a lot of cutting edge stuff for the time. There's definitely there's elements in the Declaration of Rights that served as the basis for the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution. There's this creation of a bicameral legislature that existed in the Declaration of Rights. There's also limiting factors in the Declaration of Rights that limit government authority and what they can and can't do. And there's also, as we talked at the beginning, a movement towards an anti-slavery movement. This is all coming as a result of the view from the 1760s going into the 1770s. This is what the Crown is trying to do to us. They're trying to, revoke our rights.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting. That helps to shed some light on what their, their focus was, or what their fear was. Once independence was declared, constitutions are being drafted. Do you think people who previously didn't really have an opinion about independence or not, did they start to pay more attention, or were they still most likely not too concerned as long as it didn't directly impact their day-to-day life?
That's an interesting question, and it depends on who you were. If you were a loyalist and you're starting to see an independence movement, there's a good chance you're going to up and get the heck out of there. And you're going to become a refugee. There's a gentleman named Justice Sherwood. He was a loyalist out of the Concord area, Concord, New Hampshire. He was fully in support of the Revolutionary War movement up until independence. At that point, he's like, guys, you've gone too far. I'm out.
Well,
So long.
how do you reconcile? How can you be totally in support? You know, what does that
He
even mean if you're totally in
well,
support of it, and then when there's you're
he
not going to
believed
get any satisfaction from the king?
right. He felt that there was still room to negotiate with the king,
Okay.
and so as a result, he moved away. For those who supported independence, are like, all right, this is an opportunity for us. This is an opportunity for us economically, politically, and so forth. For those who were sort of the disaffected, some of them came forward at that point, and some of them went, wait, you're doing what? And they ended up jumping to the other side. Others saw it as a, again, political or economic opportunity, so long as it didn't impact their day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Now, the people I say that impacted their day-to-day life is a perfect example where you're teaching. It's right on the Massachusetts border. For people like you and I, where I live in Merrimack, Massachusetts, and I'm literally next door to Newton, New Hampshire, ultimately following independence, two states, okay,
Yeah.
two different countries have their own currency systems, their own economic systems. You're now dealing with inflation and exchange rates and cross currency. It becomes to affect you economically. So that
Yeah.
became a problem. But it's interesting, there were some people, particularly along the borders, along the Canadian border, that had buyer's remorse following the various constitutional conventions of their states. And they saw a spike in inflation. They saw sort of a little bit of chaos, with the transition from a crown government to this own independent government. And they began to renounce their citizenship and actually cross the border into Canada,
Yeah.
which I never knew until I read the book, and it was referenced that there was this movement, particularly along the New York and what became Vermont and frontiers, in New Hampshire frontiers, where they were crossing
Interesting.
over because they rejected it. But there was some shock, but ultimately the people came together and they did support the constitutional conventions of their individual states.
Okay. Here, let me pause the recording for 1 second. Okay, we're back. Um, all right. So the states are creating their own, constitutions and
Yep.
the equivalent of Bill of Rights, maybe the precursor to our Bill of Rights.
Hmm.
There's a real concern that, the king's intention was and is maybe still to enslave them. So there's a
Yep.
little bit of paranoia or, conspiracy mindset, but they're going out of their ways as a result of that to really protect the rights of citizens. This is why
Yes.
this notion is so, central to their thinking. So
Yes.
this is going on. The revolution is being fought. The colony, the states now need to band together in some fashion to be able to have any hope to oppose, the king. And they come up with the form of our original constitution, perhaps the Articles of Confederation. What was the thought process going into creating that, that document and that government? How much do you know about that? I don't know too much about the creation of it.
I could tell you it was created by the Continental Congress.
Mm-hmm.
It was as the war was progressing and the writing was on the table that ultimately, hey, we're going to win this. So by about 1779, 1780, the war is really is slowing down in the northern colonies. It's starting to sort of get into more partisan hit and run raids in the South. And the Continental Congress is basically saying, okay, now we're going to be an independent country, hopefully. What is going to be our end game? How are we going to set up this government? And so the Continental Congress was very, very reluctant of a strong centralized
Mm-hmm.
government. It reflects this view from the colonies, now states, we are independent
Mm-hmm.
nations. So if anything, the Articles of Confederation was sort of an alliance document than anything else. There really wasn't. There was a president. Multiple people served as president of the Confederate. What
Were
were
they
the Confederate
one year
states?
1 year terms?
I think it was about 1 year terms.
Yeah.
John Hancock served several times as president of the Confederation. But they had certain things. There was no unified currency. There was no centralized legislature. There was
No
there was
judicial system.
no judicial system. There was a weak trade system that was in place. There was no federal taxation that existed, and there was no federal currency.
Mm.
So this became it was the band-aid of, okay, we're now free. And it was sort of created, again, to reflect this independent-minded spirit between all the different colonies, that they became an alliance, not a nation. And so in theory, the Confederation could have negotiated independently with the states could have negotiated independently with other countries.
Yeah.
There are some hints that was brought up during discussion that, for example, Massachusetts could negotiate with France if it wanted to, or Virginia could have negotiated with the Dutch Netherlands. So
Now,
those
okay,
those were
now explain that to me. So so you're saying under the Articles, the states had some independent authority to negotiate, with
yes.
other nations directly for trade purposes, or to become, could Massachusetts have negotiated to become part of, the French Empire, or it was
They
still expected that they were going to be this independent state, but they had some, independent authority?
they were at this point the attitude was they were going to be independent. From the crown point of view, there was this belief, and it kind of is reflected in the play of Hamilton, you'll be back.
Yeah.
There was this view going into 1780s, early 1790s, maybe at some point they may knock on our door and come back individually or collectively. But could Massachusetts, in theory, the way the Articles of Confederation were written, could they um, petition France or Spain or another colony, hey, we want to become part of your nation? In theory, they could have, because you have Vermont. Vermont, leading up to 1789, 1790, was in active negotiation with England to return to England.
I didn't know
Uh,
that.
yeah, it was in Vermont. Really, I forget when they truly became a state. I want to say it was 1790 or 1791, um, um, after the U.S. Constitution. But after the war, Vermont pretty much declared its own independence. They were no longer, but they aligned themselves with the Confederation. So they were sort of treated as that 14th state.
Yeah.
And so there was this, up until about 1790, they were negotiating with England to go back to the crown.
Wow, that's amazing. So
Yeah.
they come up with the Articles. The Articles, I mean, to some extent, this was an interim solution. It was a recognition of their independence as states, which was very important.
Yep.
It still served some purpose as they continued to fight. I mean, though maybe they were hopeful about the direction of the
Yeah.
revolution or the outcome, it still wasn't over. I mean, the Articles were still there to help to facilitate to some extent. I know Washington, perpetually had, difficulty getting money from the
Yep.
states to, pay for his army, to have an
Yep.
army and whatnot, and arms and whatnot. So ultimately, the revolution is won.
Hmm.
The Articles exist. The states are independent. Problems develop, though, as the states, as whatever bonds they felt towards one another while they were in this joint enterprise to maintain their independence. Now they start really fighting amongst themselves and,
Yes.
and screwing each other over in terms of trade and whatnot and taxation. And, great rivalries are developing between the states. And there's real concerns about whether they're going to stay unified in any fashion whatsoever if this were to continue.
That's correct. It was really a boiling point. That I Unfortunately, the Continental Congress, you can only have so much foresight to see how everything's going to go down and what's going
Yeah.
to happen. And what happened with they did not foresee Shays' rebellion, which had
that was
nothing
exactly
to do
what
with,
I was going to ask you about
yeah,
next.
it has nothing to that rebellion had nothing to do with the Articles of Confederation, or that we're against the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
dealt with the fact of local taxation, as well as unemployment and inflation, as well as debtors' rights. There was a high rate of inflation and a high rate of debt collection after the American Revolution, because during the Revolution, the Continental Congress and every state was pumping out paper money and jacking
Yeah.
prices up like there's no tomorrow. So that rebellion happened. It scared the states, because they said, in theory, their mindset was, although it hadn't happened yet, the United States could have devolved into a French Revolution scenario. Even though the French Revolution hadn't happened yet, it scared the states, where they thought, we could have revolution after revolution after revolution. We need to do something.
Yeah, and this was, this, and we talk about this in class. It's in our text, so the students are somewhat familiar with it. this is taking place in Western Massachusetts.
Yep.
There is no national government that can come to the aid of Massachusetts. Massachusetts' own authorities are so limited and largely incapable of dealing with it. My understanding was that essentially a mercenary force was hired to quell the rebellion, which it did. But this was not only something that alarmed the authorities in Massachusetts. I mean, this spread throughout the various states, and I know Washington received a report of it. And my understanding is it's one of the things that really caused him to believe that it was necessary to take some drastic action and probably come up with a new form of government, because the articles just weren't going to get it done. I mean, this was likely to happen or something like it elsewhere unless things change, and that would just be a disaster after all the money and the blood and the loss that had happened to fight for their independence.
Exactly. And it's interesting. They went into the Constitutional Convention, which was the meeting to discuss what do we do with these Articles of Confederation. The initial plan was to tweak the Articles of Confederation and just sort of play with it and massage it so that, it could be a little bit better. It was Washington, and it was some of the other, Hamilton and some of the others who came in and had the foresight to say, if we want to survive for the long run, we've got to produce something much, much better. And that's what generated the United States Constitution.
Yeah, and they weren't empowered to do this.
No.
And the articles were designed to sustain themselves in perpetuity, and no amendments could be undertaken unless all of the states agreed. And I think there also needed to be a vote in the various state legislatures as well to approve it. So there was just no way to fix the articles, even if, I suppose if the articles had something like our Article 5 in the Constitution that might have made it possible, a mechanism in place that was not impossible to work, but it just wasn't. So they had to undertake really what were secret efforts to redo everything. And it had to be secret because the states would have been concerned about losing their own power in this new form of government. And they would have quashed it immediately if they heard what was happening.
Yes, it was. They absolutely would have quashed this. I mean, this was a group of gentlemen who got together and acted way outside their authority. Each of them, when they went to this meeting, had specific instructions from their legislatures how to sort of put a Band-Aid over the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah.
What they came out with, there were some states that thought this was absolutely brilliant. There were other states that basically were outraged at what they had seen.
I know your time is limited, and I have a lot more I'd like to talk about with the Constitutional Convention and the aftermath. Is it possible that we could do this again in the future?
Oh,
this
of course,
will be sort
absolutely.
of our pre-Constitutional Convention talk, and then we'll do another one. This was great.
Absolutely.
But I don't want to rush you through that, because that's really the heart of my class. And I want to pick your brain as much as I can for that one.
I would love to come back. Absolutely. I love talking history, and I love talking about this stuff. And, the students are very fortunate to have a great professor like you. So I would love to come back.
A professor who knows great friends who will come in and give some of their time and their expertise. So that would be great. So let's stop this soon. And,
sure.
You and I will coordinate a time when we can do this again. But this is already, we're probably over an hour of recorded time. It was really helpful, I think, and it kind of sets the stage for, we can just kind of take our time as we go into the 1787 in Philadelphia, that nasty summer, and talk about what those crazy guys came up with. Yeah,
absolutely, love to.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. I'll be in touch with you, and we'll find a time to do it. And thank you again. I can't thank you enough.
No problem. Anytime, anything you need, I'm more than happy to. And please give the best to Janine and the kids as well.
I will, and you do yours. Okay,
right,
I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.